Professor Symposium, colleagues and friends. I'm supposed to be speaking on a theme which has been titled as Recent Archaeological Perspectives of Early Medieval Indian History. Now you might be wondering that what is this fellow going to speak of? Now the point is, I deliberately chose this particular theme for one or two reasons. One is that in the last 30 years or so, we reached a point in understanding of early medieval India where today we have a perspective of early medieval India largely drawn from inscriptions, which is different from what we basically knew around 1990 or so. And when I say that, I will not go into details. In about 5-7 minutes, I'll sum up the story and then try to tell you that the archaeology that is being done for early medieval times, perhaps is throwing up possibilities where the inscriptional studies and the study of archaeology, they perhaps happen to converge at some point. And now when you look into these inscriptional studies, what we basically have in the last 30 years obtained or given to us is that the early medieval centuries, roughly the 6th to the 13th centuries, are a period where you have enormous amount of agrarian growth, what you call rise in production, crops of various types, new ones also coming up in areas where they didn't exist earlier, and therefore it's a what you call potentially situation of enormous agrarian expansion and growth. Like that is what happens. Then the next thing that automatically one would ask is that if you produce more oranges than the more rice that I produce, then what do we do with that? So naturally, each one of us would want to do with part of that for an exchange. Then I would also like to have oranges and apples and things. So also you would like to have rice and wheat and something else, and therefore we would like to put it out in the market. Now it's in that kind of a context that you find that roughly from around the middle of the 8th century and after, what all of us know today, known as hutters, they basically come up. H-A-T-T-A-S, hutters basically come up. And they are coming up in all kinds of regions. The coming of hutters is happening in parts of North India, it's happening in Rajasthan, it's happening in Gujarat, it's happening in parts of South India, in Orissa, and so on all over. Now once the hutters start coming up, that's not the end of the story. Almost 100 years later, as we move to the later part of the 9th century, what you encounter is the situation where you have the rise of what you call is mandis. Now mandi all of us understand, but what we call mandi today originally was not known as a mandi, it was called a mandapika. Now mandapika is local market. So when you say local market, what you basically are going for is essentially a situation where the markets coming up which cater to say 6, 8, 10 or a dozen villages. And so number of villages from locality to locality would keep changing, but they would basically be catering to number of villages, groups of villages. Now that again doesn't end the story. As we move ahead in time, by the end of 9th, early 10th century, you enter situations where you had the rise of what you basically call pattanas. Now pattanas are commercial centers which basically come up either on the river banks or on the seashore, and these are major commercial centers. And so these are things that come up. Now when these things come up, any one of you can ask me that this obviously will not be happening in a vacuum. What happening to the trading categories? There will be people involved in exchanging, interacting, engaging in these particular centers. When you say that, naturally when you look into this side of the story, what you will find a range of trading communities also start rising. And what I'm saying is not limited to this region or that region. It's happening in Rajasthan, it's happening in Gujarat, it's happening in Orissa, in Bengal, in parts of South India, all over. And so the trade communities that are coming up are known by terms such as your Avaniks, they're known as Shreshtis, they are known as Rajashreshti, Urashreshti, Vyapari, and by other terms that we know across regions. And the rise of these Vanikas, or this kind of trade communities, they are hierarchized, they're graded, some of them are doing very well, others not so well, but in the middle order or at the bottom of the layer and so on. Now these categories, when they arise, they automatically lead to the coming of, not in every region, but in some parts, especially we know that for South India, if you get to Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra and Tamil Nadu, in that part, that they all got organized, what we call is, large kind of guild organizations. The guild organizations that they organize themselves into are largely known to us So people who do their, what you call, textbook studies would understand. We have terms like Ayovole 500. We have terms like Manigrama. We have terms like Anjuvanam and so on. Now what the difference between these categories is, Ayovole 500 is basically something which confines within a particular region. Manigramam cuts across regions. And when you're talking of something like Anjuvanam, now Anjuvanam is an organization which does trade from South India with West Asia. So these are things that come up. Now to back up this evidence, you have other interesting instances coming up, because I think I'll end this particular story with that and then move on to something else. This is in coast of Kerala, you have a place called Kovalam. Now Kovalam is a site which yields a trade charter dated to the mid-9th century. Interestingly, the trade charter happens to be signed in 5 different languages. It's signed in Arabic, in Persian, in Jewish, in Malayalam, and in Sanskrit. The importance of the trade charter would lie in the fact that all these 5 kinds of different people were perhaps there at the site who are signatories to this particular trade charter, showing that trade and things are happening. And this is in the middle of the 9th century. And then from there, as you go ahead, by the 12th century, end 11th century, 12th century, we have something called, some of us might be familiar with this, called the Ginza records. It's essentially 11th, 12th century that you have the Ginza records coming from Cairo, and from a synagogue they basically emerge. And so they tell us about how trade is being carried out between West Asia, Persian Gulf, down to the west coast, taking us down to Malabar. So that trading thing is happening. As a part of that, we have an interesting figure, some of us might be familiar with that name, is a gentleman called Ibrahim bin Iju. Ibrahim bin Iju, sitting at Bangalore, is trading in spices with your Persian Gulf, West Asia, and say your Eastern called Africa. That is this orbit. This is what is happening. Now this is the kind of a story that basically emerges. So what the story tells us is agrarian growth leading to markets, merchants, trade, and that's what is basically happening. And what we should not forget is that this trade that we are talking about, this trade is simply not happening with Central Asia, with West Asia and Persian Gulf and what you call your Eastern Africa. This trade is a part of a larger network in the sense that touches South India, Sri Lanka, takes us down Southeast Asia and goes into China. So that is the trade which is being controlled by the Arabs in the early part. That's your later part of the 8th century, and after it will be controlled by the Arabs. And subsequently, the Chinese get into that whole business. And so this is what is happening. Now that is the story that we basically gather from your inscription thing. Now having known that, the point is, how does archaeology help us, or can archaeology help us in taking that story forward? I mean, look into archaeology. All of us sitting here, we know that one of the earliest efforts at synthesizing archaeological data was done by Professor R.S. Sharma. Now, the more substantial work that he produced, as many of us here know, is Urban Decay in India, 300 to 1000. Book was published in 87. But just to familiarize you with that historiography, all I would say is that Professor Sharma started off with that argument in 1965. That argument was placed in a more systematic fashion in 1972 at the Muzaffar session of the Indian History Congress, and then it took the shape of a wholesale book in 87. Now if you look into that book, you find about 140 sites excavated and explored material have been put together. And that material that Professor Sharma puts together, he also demonstrated that with bar diagrams and tells us particular history that archaeology goes on to tell us. Now once the book was published, the book, like any book, came in for judgment, and there were some people who pointed out that look, I think the sites in Rajghat or at Ujjain or this site there or that site there, don't want to mention half a dozen names, but people mention about half a dozen names of sites, saying that these sites do not confirm or go with what Professor Sharma was telling us. But the point is, the sheer weight of data that Professor Sharma had collected together, put them together, now that basically, in some senses negated these kinds of criticisms. You think भाई 140 साइट में से 6 साइट में ठीक नहीं बैठ रहा है, लेकिन बाकी 134 में तो बैठ रहा है. And so that's the situation which basically obtained. And so, but I would not like to go into the story here. I would like to tell you a different kind of a story. The different story is what I was just telling you. In the last 30 years, what historians have been trying to do is to tell us that agrarian growth, where does it lead us to? What are the logical consequences of agrarian growth and where it does lead us to? And I just give you a summary of the story. Now, does archaeology help us in that particular thing? Now, here more recently, especially 2014 and after, there's a gentleman called Jason Hawkes. Now, he has produced some nice articles which are some bearing the Jason Hawkes. He is a person who works in the museum. He has produced some nice articles where he problematizes or raises questions about the way early medieval archaeology has been done. Now, I can't be summarizing what he said, but I'll take up some of the issues that he's raising. Now, from the beginning, the issue that I would like to put across is that he discusses at length the Vakataka inscriptions. Now, Professor Jamkhedkar is the one who is, has worked on Vakataka sites. Now, what he has done is he goes on to plot the Vakataka inscriptions and tell us what is the location that they have, what is the archaeology of the Vakataka sites, or what is the geography of the Vakataka sites. And the conclusion that he arrives at is that the Vakataka land grant charters that you find are mostly located at important archaeological sites, close to, around archaeological sites. And so what would be the implications of that story? Now that thing, he likes to basically relate to larger generalizations, which he hints at but does not really engage in. And so therefore he draws some other maps. And what he tells us, he let us look at the story of land grants between the 4th and the 7th century, and the Vakataka grants fall within that time bracket. So it treats it. Now, what he tells us, that doesn't really take us very far. For reasons I'll tell you. Point is, historians in the last 30 years have already looked into the distribution of land grants during the 4th, 7th centuries. And they tell us that if you look at the distribution of land grants during the 4th, 7th century, the picture that you get, because this is the early stage of land grants, it's a very uneven kind of distribution pattern that you would see. And what would be the implications of this distribution pattern? It would have some implication for local state formation, spread of Puranic ideas, epic ideas, Vedic ideas, and so on and so forth. And it would also mean agrarian spread of growth in some sense or the other, and so on. Then, what is that it will also mean? It will also mean that some amount of what we call vana or aranya is also opened up. Because when you say some land grants are made, not necessarily in settled areas, but some land grants are made in uncultivable areas, forest areas, or such places. Now, where are these grants made? If you look at the land grants, you come across terms like vana and aranya. Now, what Jason would say, aranya would basically mean, vana would mean forest in real terms. It means the vana or forest would be separated from settlement or habitation. And therefore, the grants that were being given to people should have been away from, not in and around the settlements. But here, two things as students of history we should remember. The two things we remember is, if you look into ancient literature, if you see how the two terms vana and kshetra are treated, that gives us some clues. Now if you look into the expression vana and kshetra, the two terms, the way they are treated is, they are not treated in opposition to each other. They are treated in continuum. When I say treated in continuum, आज जो वना है, कल वो क्षेत्र का हिस्सा बन सकता है. जो कल्टिवेबल एरिया आज है, तो पहले वना था, वहाँ से कल्टिवेबल एरिया बना. इसका मतलब नहीं है कि आज ये कल्टिवेबल एरिया बन गया, तो 5 किलोमीटर तक कुछ नहीं होगा, उसके बाद ही बना शुरू होगा. Both of them, they coexist. And what I'm saying comes out beautifully if you look into Jataka literature of the early centuries AD and after. In Jataka literature you would see there's a settlement, goat sheep वन में घुस जाते हैं, आदमी जाता है उसको खोज के ले आने के लिए, or you want to go to another village, you're cutting through the vana and moving there, and therefore the vana and the settlement of Janapada or Kshetra, they are coexistent, and it's not as if there's a marked difference between the two. Now that's the point that doesn't somehow happen to miss out. One. Secondly, when the 4th, 7th centuries are the early period of land grants that have been made, naturally the grants that will be made, they need not necessarily be made in deep forests. They will be made in vana, which will be adjoining some of the settlements. And so these are issues that got to be kept in mind, and before what you call taking what Jason has to tell us. Besides that, then we move to other things. And the other thing that I say, archaeologists increasingly are pointing to the fact that it's perhaps more useful to study settlement complexes rather than a settlement. By that, what I'm meaning is that as students of history, all of us know that any area that you might look into, there may not be just a settlement, there could be more number of settlements in a given area. So it's better to study these settlements in relation to one another rather than just picking on a settlement. Now, why I'm saying that is that some studies have been made, for example, at places like your, what should I say, Nivasa. Now, at Nivasa, you have what you call 3 mounds. Now, one of the mounds have been excavated, the other 2 have not been excavated. But for the last 20 years, what people have observed is that the 2 unexcavated mounds that you have noticed, after rains every time, they go on yielding a large number of early medieval sculptures. So the argument that they make is that it is only the first mound that was excavated which shows that habitation continued after the 4th century and not after, whereas the other 2 mounds which have not been excavated, if they continuously yield in the last 2 decades sculptures after rains, there's need to work out those mounds and then tell us that whether these are occupied in the early medieval period or not. The reason is, increasingly there's a realization among historians and archaeologists that settlements are not static. Settlements are dynamic, they move. And particularly when you're looking into a multicultural settlement, then it's not necessary that if you have a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer area, under him all settlements for 500 years or more will continue. Settlements can just move away from the original hub and just be a little away. And what I'm saying, that story is nicely captured at a place called Besnagar in Vidisha. Besnagar and Vidisha, all of us know. Besnagar particular inscription, we all have some idea. Vidisha is the next slide. Besnagar, beyond a point, doesn't grow. But when Besnagar stops growing, it is Vidisha that starts growing. That's in the sense that it's quite possible that people from Besnagar just move to the adjoining site, and that's what contributes to the rise of Vidisha, and therefore Besnagar dies out. That's the kind of situation that for people to see. Now, what I'm saying, that point gets further strengthened. If you look into a nice village-to-village survey that Professor Karashima conducted in the late 70s. Now, Tamil Nadu, all of us know, in Tamil Nadu there is a district called Tiruchirappalli district. In Tiruchirappalli district, there is a taluk. And this taluk is, what should I say, what's that name of the taluk? Lalgudi taluk. Lalgudi. Lalgudi taluk. Now, Lalgudi taluk, there is a village-to-village survey. And what they obtained in the village-to-village survey is the fact that what they found is that whatever number of these early historic settlements were there, when the settlements during the Pallava period start coming up, they don't come up next to those early historic settlements. They come up 2 kilometers, 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers away from the early historic settlement. And the number of early historic settlements happen to be more than the ones that had died as early historical settlements. Clearly showing that when one takes what you call notice of the fact whether new sites are coming up or old sites are dying out or whatever, it is perhaps more useful to look at site complexes rather than a site. And increasingly, the surveys that people are conducting in various parts, whether it is your Indian part of your Barendra region in northern Bengal or the Bangladesh side of Barendra region in Bangladesh, surveys in Kashmir, and elsewhere that people have done, they show that the early medieval centuries are centuries where new settlements are coming up, and people are trying to demonstrate that the number of settlements that we're talking about, agrarian expansion and so on. Agrarian expansion will automatically mean not only more food and crops, but it will also mean new habitation, people would settle down in new areas and so on. The number of settlements will also automatically rise. So that's the point that the archaeological story goes on to reinforce. Besides these things, the other thing that the gentleman went on to do is to, in another article, try to chart how many early medieval settlements can you map on the Indian Sea. Interestingly, he maps out 108 early medieval settlements on the map of India. Now, interestingly, because you see, I am familiar with places like Orissa and Chhattisgarh. And so I try to cross-check my evidence with that thing. And for Chhattisgarh and Orissa, there are huge blanks. Whereas I know for certain, and I can tell you, for example, in the last, say, 20 years, in the case of Orissa, there have been places like Maripatna, Khalapatapatna, there have been sites like Barabati, leave aside Buddhist sites like Udayagiri, Khandagiri, and Lalitgiri, which have been excavated. Similarly, in the context of Chhattisgarh, there have been sites like Sirpur, Malhar, and one more recently excavated site reported in Manual Environment. So these are there. So the point that I'm trying to basically make is that the 108 sites that have been mapped on that map that the gentleman shows, Jason Hawks, it's a conservative estimate. Because in many cases what happens is, when people from outside come and want to collect some data and put them together, they will look up at some more major journals. They won't pick up journals which are locally popular or regionally more useful. And therefore, many of these things would be missing. And therefore, the 108 is a conservative figure. The figure could be much larger, one. Secondly, in the context of looking at early medieval sites, one needs to be a little bit more careful than we have so far perhaps usually been. And that I'll try to what you will argue by pointing out two different kinds of issues. One is I take the example of Bhubaneswar because I come from Orissa and happen to know Bhubaneswar, that's why it's still better. And you see, in Bhubaneswar, if somebody were to make judgments on the basis of Sisupalgarh, one would say, okay, Sisupalgarh, the earliest dates that have been pushed back today is about 500 BC. It was there under the Mauryas. It may have continued under Kharavela, and so the topmost layers would come up to the 4th century AD, and that's the end of the story. But then, all of us know that the area in which Sisupalgarh is located, in the opposite direction, about 9 kilometers away, you have the Udayagiri Khandagiri caves. That is also a part of old Bhubaneswar. And when you're talking about early medieval Bhubaneswar, where you have all these temples from the earliest groups from the mid-7th century down to Lingaraj and whatever, these are in a different part of Bhubaneswar. And therefore, the Bhubaneswar, the city itself, if you see, these are located in different corners. And therefore, when we talk about the story of studying site complexes, that perhaps makes better sense rather than concentrating on a site and then reaching and saying, okay, this site was over in this particular century. Then maybe it will be more useful to go and tap nearby centers and see whether and how things happen. In fact, they ever had actually happened. And so that's the kind of thing that one will have to keep in mind. And so that is something that I thought that I should mention. And this can be checked up with reference to other places also. And like Bhubaneswar, the early medieval center comes up in the case of Orissa, so did a place like Puri and Konark and other things come up. And similar things happened across other regions as well. Early medieval major centers, they came up. For example, closer home in North India, for example, Kannauj. Now, Kannauj is not an excavated site, but Kannauj, we all know the Rashtrakuta, the Palas and these Gujar Patihars were fighting for Kannauj, and Kannauj had a glory of its own to share with others. And so that was the important sentence all of us know. And so similar sites can be talked about. Or for that matter, Thaneshwar. And Thaneshwar has been excavated. It's called Karn Katila, and so Thaneshwar for the times of Harsha yields good material. And so that is there. And so for different regions, one can talk about different sites and so on. Anyway, that's one part of the story. The other part, and this is something I'm trying to basically summarize what Jason Hawks has to tell us, and that is interesting. This is what we are told is that there are on 3 markers, on the foundations of 3 markers, that perhaps we need to rethink our early medieval archaeology. Now, what are these 3 important markers? Now, these basically relate to pottery types. Now, the pottery types that the gentleman goes on to mention. Now, you might be familiar with some of them, and in fact, one of them was there in the museum that we saw today. One is, many of us are told that normally how is the early medieval archaeologically defined? When the early medieval is archaeologically defined, what we are told is there are layers below which produced red polished ware or your Roman amphorae. Those layers are below. Then follows something called the early medieval. And above the early medieval, what do we get? we get turquoise glazed ware. That's what we saw actually in the museum today, glazed ware. Now when you're talking about turquoise glazed ware, usually if you look in the archaeological reports, usually in the archaeological report what you would find, they are dated to the 14th century or at times 11th century, not below that. And therefore, that is what we basically obtain. But what the gentleman goes on to tell us is that if you look into the histories of these potteries, in more recent times, it's a different story that we basically gather. Now what is the story that we gather? He tells us, for example, if we talk about red glazed ware. Now red glazed ware, which was believed, report after report that we find in India, that we produced, that's the story. Roughly 3rd, 5th century is the terminal point. Red glazed ware do not go beyond the 5th century, 3rd, 4th century में वो खत्म हो जाते हैं, and that's how. However, at Amreli, A-M-R-E-L-I, Amreli is a site on the Gujarat coast. At Amreli, it has been dated to the 6th century. More interestingly, at two places. One is your Eastern Africa, the other is UAE, United Arab Emirates. And they are under controlled conditions, the excavations that are conducted, they produce red glazed ware, which has been dated to the 8th century. And interestingly, this red glazed ware are Indian exports. And therefore, the point that is being made is that red glazed ware goes up to the 8th century, and this is being exported from India, and therefore that is how it is. And so, if there was only one kind of evidence, one would have said, "Pata nahi sahi hai, galat hai, kya hai?" So one would have been skeptical about the whole evidence. But that's one part of the story. Then you come down to the other thing, and this is what you call second kind of thing, that pottery that I was mentioning. This is turquoise glazed ware. Now, turquoise glazed ware, when you say what normally people call Islamic glazed ware, all of us know it has a beige foundation, and the glazed part is normally blue, green, yellow, and white. And as I mentioned earlier, people thought that it was as late as 14th century or most 11th century, it can't come below that. But increasingly, it is being told that these were being produced in the early centuries itself, from around the 3rd century. These were being produced in South Arabia, in the Mesopotamia region, and exported all around. But in the Indian situation, we find the evidence for this ware that is coming up in the 8th, 9th century context. And that 8th, 9th century context that I'm mentioning is reported not from a site, but some sites. There is a site called Sanjam in Gujarat, Maharashtra wala history aa jata hai Gujarat, that part. You have a site called Chaul, C-H-A-U-L, Chaul, C-H-A-U-L, the Maharashtra coast. You go down further, you have Pattanam in the Kerala coast, P-A-T-T-A-N-A-M. And interestingly, Pattanam has produced more than 2,000 sherds of this glazed ware. And so I'm just mentioning 3, but there are half a dozen sites which produce this glazed ware. And on the eastern coast, on the Odisha coast, there are 2 places in and around Chilka Lake which also produce this, and where we are told they would go up to the 8th, 9th centuries AD. Thirdly, this is third kind of a pottery, which is called torpedo ware. Now, about torpedo ware, the point that I would like to basically make is that torpedo ware is a kind of a pottery which we are told earlier people had confused that with Roman amphorae, and gradually you realize that it's not Roman amphorae, it's a torpedo ware, and when people are confused that with Roman amphorae, it was dated up to the 3rd century and not beyond that. But once you identify that clearly as torpedo ware, the torpedo ware is again something which comes from West Asia, Persian Gulf, that belt, onto the Indian coast, and is again dated up to the 8th century. And this is again found at several sites on the Indian coast, at Sri Lanka, and goes into Southeast Asia. And so the point that the gentleman would like to basically make, Hawks, is that on the basis of this evidence, what we reach today is that those sites which we had dated only up to the 4th, 5th century, and then said कि इसके बाद ये नहीं बना रहेगा, maybe some of those sites would go up the ladder into the 8th, 9th centuries. And therefore, what we had thought ended in the early historic sites might actually be early medieval sites. And therefore, it's not as if one is trying to argue that all the chronologies across sites need a revision, but if not all, some of them surely need a revision. That's the point that I'm basically making. to make that point further, or to rub in that whole issue more strongly, he goes on to examine the data of a site called Nagara, Nagare. Now, Nagara is a site in Gujarat. Now, if you look at the site of Gujarat and Nagara evidence, what you encounter is these things. That you have evidence of torpedo ware, you have evidence of turquoise glazed pottery, which take up the story to the 8th century very easily, and then you have the coming of the Chalukyan temples in the 10th, 11th century and after, and so the argument is that early medieval settlements are alive, they are not all dead, and that's the story that is. And so that's the point that you can say that elsewhere in other parts of the country, sites need closer examination and so on and so forth. Now, these issues that are being talked about and presented, some of that story is carried further by some other people also. Now, the lady who was teaching at Shantiniketan called Sina Panja. Now, this lady has resigned her job and she is doing independent work on her own. Now, this lady worked in the Varandra region. The Varandra region, also you would know, is northern parts of Bengal. Northern parts of Bengal, Varandra region. Now, that area she worked. Now, there, she worked on a place called Balupur. Balupur is the name of the site. And she produced a book in 2015, which is what you call basically trying to talk about an area which is flooded continuously. And so that's the area that she and her colleagues worked on. And the point she makes is that roughly between the 6th and the 18th century, what is the picture that obtains for the Varandra region, Balupur area? What is the kind of food habit, subsistence levels, day-to-day living conditions? Now all that she goes on to discuss and tells us that in the early medieval period, that these people, they didn't have a thriving economy, but nevertheless the economy was sort of broad-based kind of a thing, that they relied on agricultural products, on forest products, on fishing, and all kinds of things, and that this area was also a part of a network of trade and so on. There were sewn coins, 11th century and all, they are obtained there, and that kind of story. And she tells us that working out a settlement hierarchy in that area is a bit of a problem. Settlement hierarchy, all of us understand. That you will have a big city, you will have a town, you will have villages, hamlets, so you can work out a settlement hierarchy. Now, working out those kind of stories is difficult there, largely because of the fact that this is a flooded area. The rivers basically are in a state quite continuously, and because of which material gets washed out. So either you have some important permanent sites like Bangar, Mahasthangar, or you don't have, or you just get flimsy material. And so she discusses all these problems, and this is the story she was revealing, that in early medieval times you do have sites there in the difficult terrains as well. Now what she tells us here, the same story is repeated for the other side of ancient Bengal or present-day Bangladesh. Now there is a gentleman called Swadhin Sen who teaches at Jahangirnagar University, Dhaka, and he for the last 5-7 years has been continuously working on the Varandra side of ancient Bengal or present-day Dhaka. And he is working essentially between Bangar and Mahasthangar. And so these are the kinds of things that he also has to say what Sina Panja told us, similar thing. And to add to that, all I would like to basically say is that what Swadhin Sen does is that uses the clustering of ponds that he finds in his area to work out settlement structures, and tells us that the number of structures that he encountered made of brick are very few. It is essentially administrative and religious structures that are in brick, otherwise not, because brick was a luxury in that kind of flooded situation, and so these are things. Along with what you call these people, there are other one or two people that some of you might be familiar. These are people like Supriya Verma and Jaya Menon, and these people have also done some work, but more importantly, I will refer to their article that they published in 2008. Now, the 2008 article is interesting because they published this article where they went to argue that using religious and ethnic labels for archaeological data is problematic. And they make that point largely because by saying that they studied about half a dozen sites. They studied Thaneshwar, Hastinapur, Ataranji Khera, their own site of Indore Khera. They looked into Lalkot, Purana Killa, and Rajghat. And looked into the sites. The conclusion that they derived was that the archaeological layers between 9th, 10th century and the 14th, 15th centuries do not show much of a difference. Because in terms of everyday, day-to-day, what you call living, the dish and the bowl and the basic utensils that we basically encounter remain almost the same. And therefore, to say that this is Rajput and this is Sultanate and so on, it has its problems. So the larger point that they're basically making is that so far you're using labels like this is Buddhist and Jain and this is something else, fine. So that at least there's a religious affiliation, one understand. But then to come down to saying that this is Hindu and this is Islamic and this is Muslim and this is Sultanate and that is Mughal, these labels don't really hold for the simple reason that daily lives of people or the pots and pans that they use, they don't change. They continue as they were, and that's what the larger argument that they're making by comparing the data from different sides. That's the point that they want to make. And so the point is that when you look into early medieval archaeology, these are the what you call kinds of issues and stories that basically want to emerge. Before I conclude, the other thing I thought I should also talk about are one or two things. One is, in the context of early medieval archaeology, a lot of field surveys have been conducted. It's not excavations, a lot of field surveys people have done. Some people have done it in Kashmir, some people have done it in the context of coastal Orissa, some people in Gujarat, and some of these people in Bengal that have pointed out. But what emerges interestingly as common is that from the large-scale field surveys, we get a story that religious life of the people that you basically get, well, that each area that they are looking into happens to be largely multi-religious. And that, for as students of history, is important because historiographical, there has been a problem that we have all engaged in. The problem that we have engaged in is, I am interested in Vaishnavism, I study Vaishnavism, and for me, site A and B and C and D, these are Vaishnava sites. You study Saivism, so for you, E, F, G, H are Saiva sites, and therefore, the story that we basically create is as if there's a set of Vaishnava sites versus a set of Saiva sites. Whereas when you do archaeology, when you survey, you pick up material from the same site. ये वैष्णव भी मिल रहा है, शैव भी मिल रहा है, बुद्धिस्ट भी है, जैन भी है, दुर्गा भी है और कुछ भी है. And so that that each of these localities happen to be multi-religious sites, and that each of these, if the major site is a particular center, that these happen to be sites which are shared by multiple religions, and that is the story that basically comes to across regions increasingly. Last point I would like to basically make is coming to the story of coins, which I'll try to summarize briefly. And my story of coins is largely based on the writings of two people. One, most of you will be familiar, that book that John Dale wrote in 1990 called Living Without Silver, where he goes on to point out that in the Gujarat Pratyahara territory or in large parts of Uttar Pradesh, that district-wise he points out that these are the districts where you have these coins available. And so that the number of coins that were available in northern India, in northwestern India, he would argue were in no way less than the coins that were in circulation earlier. His point was that the two things: one, that because of the paucity of silver and the greater demand for coins, naturally some adjustments had to be made. And the adjustment was these coins that were produced, these are smaller denomination coins, small size coins. And so they were not as nice and beautiful, or what you call, as nicely produced as the early historic coins, but in terms of numbers, they were equally as good as the early time that you would basically argue. More recently, what has happened is that there is a gentleman called Shailendra Bhandari. Now, Shailendra Bhandari produced a 40-page paper in 2015, where he basically summarizes the story of coins across South Asia. That's from Kashmir, Gandhara to Bangladesh. So that is what he basically does. What he goes on to tell us, is that the picture that you obtain for coins is that from the 7th, 9th centuries, you have local dynasties having issued coins in Kashmir, and that story continues from 7th, 9th in subsequent period as well. If you come down to areas like Rajasthan, Malwa, large parts of northern India as such, what you find are coins known as, and many of us might know, Indo-Sasanian coins, or what people call, for example, North India largely, Vigrahpala and Vijayapala coins. These coins are also known as Gadheya coins or Gadheya paisa. If you move into Bengal, you again find coins from different parts of Bengal. You find them from northern Bengal. Find them in Mainamati. Mainamati would be present there. Samatra region of Bengal. Samatra region of Bangladesh. Mainamati. If you go into that area called Arakan, which is say southeastern Bangladesh and west part of Burma, Arakan, that region, there is the other region. It gives evidence to say that okay, these are the coins that come from the 8th, 9th century, these are the coins that come later, and so on and so forth. Similar evidence you would produce for the western coast, right from the time of the Vakachakras through the western Chalukyas to the Rashtrakutas, that there are coins that are being issued there. Moving to Andhra Pradesh, you would tell us that from Vishnu Kundins to the eastern Chalukyas, there is evidence of coins. Go to the Pallavas, it's the same story. And the larger point you would make is that gold and silver and copper were being used across the subcontinent, and largely it was gold and silver, and because silver was not much in extensive use, therefore many times what we produced was silver coated copper coins. Now when I say these things, anyone of you can stand up and say that, look, what about the gold coins that you're talking? Now the point is, I have not worked on this. I am only citing Sarada Bhandare, and he gives you evidence to show that gold coins have been produced by Rashtrakutas, they are produced by the Palas, and including these Patihalas, Palas, and Rashtrakutas, all of them issued plenty of coins. That is the evidence that he produces, which earlier we did not have. He gives you instances, for example, of a Devapala and a Dharmapala who have issued gold coins. Now, when I say these things, then the question will arise is that what was missing earlier, and why is that we did not take cognizance of these coins? Now, the reasons that we provided are as follows. The reasons are, one is coins that we didn't take into consideration earlier, largely because these early medieval coins that we're talking about, especially from North India and Eastern India that we are talking, are coins which are difficult to ascribe. Difficult to ascribe because it is difficult to identify which dynasty issued which coin. Difficult to say that Raja A or Raja B or Raja C issued these coins. And when coins cannot be ascribed, then there's a problem. There's a problem because museums would refuse to buy them. You see, the point is when you go to a museum, how are the museum collections brought up? Museum would be interested if you say, right, for the Gupta period, I have an archer type, I have an equestrian type, I have an Asometa type, the curator will be more happy to buy those things. But if you have a bunch of coins, which you don't know whose coins and whether they're 8th century or 10th century. So the point that he's making is that because of the difficulties in inscription, therefore museums are not willing to buy them, and when museums are not willing to buy them, forget they're being exhibited on the museum. That's one problem. Secondly, the other problem that basically emerges is the coming or the continuation of some series of coins, even posthumously. So when he says some coins being issued posthumously, the point that he makes is that especially in the context of Bengal and in Western India, you have evidence of some Gupta coins because they were locally acceptable going on well into the 8th century. But earlier what happened is, for example, the archetype in Bengal, the archetype in Bengal they thought is something which is being issued by one of the major Guptas, and so the coin would be ascribed to the 5th century. Whereas he argues that these coins are of the 8th century, and the reason for his arguing these coins to be of the 8th century or 5th century are based on the fact that though the obverse of the coin shows the archetype, the reverse of the coin does not show a Vaishnava symbol. The Guptas are Vaishnavas. It shows the Saiva symbol, and plus the letters that are there represents a local ruler who would be dated to the 8th century. And therefore, there are instances of coins being produced posthumously in terms of the typology. And therefore, it's better if you consider this an 8th century coin, then the story changes. If you ascribe it to the 5th century, then it's a different kind of a story. And so the issue is, how do you look at the coins? And so one is the problem of ascribing the coins with a dynasty or with a ruler, or we're looking at them as being posthumous or not. So this is what had complicated the story that the argument is basically going to make. Now, when you put up these things together, all this story, perhaps in some senses, tie up with what we started with. The epigraphic picture that we started with, what it tells us that story perhaps gets reinforced by some of the archaeological tendencies that are there. Now, there's a whole lot of work to be done, a whole lot of things that one would expect to come up in the future, but there are some tendencies which I thought that it's time that we knew. Now, whether we like it, criticize it, or accept it, that's for us to do. Thank you.
On R.S. Sharma.
Yes. So actually, my basic position, Professor Sharma, is that what he did with urban decay, that stands the same position that it stood when it was published. For the simple reason that there are basically two reasons why I say that it stands where it was in 1987. It doesn't go out of the esteem in which it was basically held. There are two reasons for that. Reason number one is that Professor Sharma relied on the archaeological reports produced by Archaeological Survey of India and others. Now, we relied on that. Now, if you look into the report after report, whether it's a survey or anybody, that is the picture that they give you. Up to the Gupta period, they are very fondly discussing ये भी मिला, वो भी मिला, वो भी मिला. Once you are the 4th century, layers of flimsy हो गया, और कुछ नहीं मिल रहा है, उसके बाद glacier मिलने लगा है. And so, the manner in which the treatment of the data is presented in the archaeological reports, when somebody uses this report, and report after report, not a report or two reports, and so report after report when one uses, that is the picture one would get. And therefore, Professor Sharma used that, and that is the conclusion. So that was what you call first-rate synthesis of the data that was available at that particular point in time. And secondly, the reason is, even today whatever is happening, no one is questioning Professor Sharma's idea of the decay of second urbanization. By 6th century BC में या 5th century BC में जो urban process शुरू हुआ after the Harappan experience that being the first, that might have been dwindling by Gupta period. That is something that no one is questioning. Along with that, what historians of early medieval India are suggesting is that because from the 4th, 7th century, the agrarian grant and expansion and growth and all the business starts off, that has its own momentum. It has a spiraling process. And so that momentum of the spiral that it produces is that when it produce hoga, beyond a point, by 8th century, more produce hone lagega, to jayega kidhar. That's how the other things start happening, and they tie up that story. So this is the story of the third urbanization coming into being, not the story of the undoing of the second urbanization. Second urbanization story, rising, falling, it's Professor Sharma's work, that stands where it is, and this is a separate chapter that opens up with this epigraphic study that people have engaged in, and the third urbanization. And the interesting linkage for the third urbanization would be, I'm very afraid of saying this though, especially with Professor Habib here, is that, you see, when we talk about the urbanization process under the Sultanate, the process of urbanization of the Sultanate doesn't come from nowhere. Some of that comes from this early medieval urbanization. The early medieval urban process, because some of these mandapikas or some of these patranas, they go on to form nodal points, and that's where the rise of some of the cities takes place. I'm not saying all the cities, but some of that process moves into the Sultanate, and therefore, when we talk about urbanization of the Sultanate, that some of it draws its strength from within the urban processes that were unleashed within the early medieval times itself.